Towards the month of September 1943, Denmark was experiencing one of the most dramatic moments in its history. At that time, it was under the rule of Germany, whose troops had occupied the country and annexed it to the Third Reich 3 years earlier. Although it may seem incredible, the Nazis had not launched a persecution against the Jewish population as they did in other nations. In Denmark, they allowed them to maintain their rights and living conditions. This was explained by the small number of Jews living there. The total was only about 8,000 people. However, the situation was about to take a 180-degree turn. Herbert Pundik is a journalist who wrote his memoirs about those dark days. In them, he recalls that in 1943, he was a young high school student taking French classes in the city of Copenhagen. He came from a Jewish family, so he was used to being on guard, but nothing prepared him for what was about to happen. While he was chatting with his classmates at school, a teacher rushed into the classroom. After catching his breath, he looked at his students and said, "You have to escape. The Germans could arrive at any moment." It took Pundik a few hours to understand what was happening. Adolf Hitler had finally given the order to annihilate all the Jews in Denmark. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you how the Danish Jews managed to save themselves from the clutches of Nazism. To understand this story, we must go back to the early stages of World War II. In April 1940, when Hitler was convinced he could conquer all of Europe, he sent a military expedition to Denmark with the aim of occupying the country. The Danish government was aware that if they resisted, their population would be massacred by German tanks. It was a tough decision, but the political leaders chose to surrender and hand over the keys of the state to the Nazis rather than provoke the death of thousands of innocents. On their part, the Third Reich announced that the maneuver was not a conquest but an act of protection, aimed at safeguarding the Danes from the Allies. In an attempt to win the approval of the Danish people, the Nazis allowed them to retain some political autonomy. King Christian X remained on the throne as head of state, and the government and parliament retained their political functions. Nevertheless, it is worth noting that there were occupation authorities that had to be consulted for all major decisions, so Danish independence was nothing more than an illusion. One of the issues that sparked the most conflicts between Denmark and Germany was the fate of the Jewish population. As expected, the Nazis pressured Danish officials to take action against them, starting with deportation. However, local authorities managed to postpone the issue for nearly 3 years, arguing that the Jewish population of Denmark was so small that it wasn't worth bothering about. Thanks to this, they were not forced to register in a public registry or sew a yellow star on their arms, as they were required to do in other countries. This precarious balance finally erupted in the summer of 1943, just as the Third Reich began to lose control of the war and suffered serious defeats in North Africa and the Soviet Union. Now, the situation had changed, and it no longer seemed impossible that the Allies would emerge victorious from the conflict. In this context, the Danish resistance movement, led by the civilian population, gained strength. People took to the streets of major cities calling for the liberation of Denmark, and marches, protests, and strikes multiplied throughout the country. Nazi domination hung by a thread, and the occupying forces were aware of it. For this reason, they demanded that the Danish leaders declare a state of emergency, suppress the protesters, and execute the most dangerous ones. Faced with these demands, Hitler's followers sought to respond as they usually did, by applying terror and sowing death to quell the opposition. However, local authorities were not willing to shed the blood of their compatriots to appease the Nazis. On August 29, 1943, the Danish government announced its resignation in solidarity with the civilian population. The Germans had no choice but to take direct control of Denmark's administration. Now, they could no longer hide behind any puppet government. One of the first measures taken by the new cabinet was to implement the final solution in the country, arresting Jews and deporting them to concentration camps. To do this, the Gestapo searched the facilities of the Jewish community, looking for books, family records, and documents that would make it easy for them to identify its members. On September 15, 1943, Hitler officially approved the sending of Danish Jews to the Third Reich's extermination camps. The chosen date for the arrests was October 1 of that year, coinciding with the celebration of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Everything was ready for one of the largest raids in Denmark's history, although no one suspected that things would not go as the Nazis expected. Hans Hedtoft, the spokesperson for the Danish Social Democratic Party, learned of the deportation plan through his contacts at the German embassy. The political leader contacted other party leaders to inform them of the situation, so the news spread like wildfire. Within hours, the chief rabbi of the community, Marcus Melchior, was also informed. On the morning of September 29, with only 2 days left before the arrests began, religious services in the synagogues were interrupted by a terrible warning. The rabbis warned attendees that their lives were in danger and that they had to act carefully if they did not want to perish in gas chambers. The Jews received help from many Danes who, despite not being part of the Jewish community, decided to risk their lives and help their neighbors. Faced with the cruelty of Nazism, their response was solidarity and compassion. Some opened their homes for Jews to hide inside. There were doctors and nurses who admitted them to hospitals under false names to conceal their origins. On the other hand, Catholic and Protestant priests allowed them to hide in the church attics, knowing that the Nazi troops would not dare to search there for fear of earning the population's antipathy. Sometimes, the help consisted of something as simple as notifying another person that they had to get to safety as soon as possible. In general, these were improvised and spontaneous actions that were not coordinated by any higher authority. Despite valiant efforts to preserve as many human lives as possible, 500 Jews were arrested during the Rosh Hashanah holiday. They were elderly residents of Copenhagen nursing homes who, being isolated from the rest of their families, could not be saved or did not learn of the deportations in time. They were all sent to the Theresienstadt concentration camp in Czechoslovakia. A significant number of those who were saved escaped to Sweden, taking advantage of its proximity to Denmark, just 10 kilometers away. The Swedish government had shown itself willing to receive the Jewish population, so the best chance of survival was to flee there. For this, they had the assistance of Danish fishermen who transported them on their boats across the Øresund Strait. The journey lasted only an hour, but it was necessary to cross a sea buffeted by fierce winds and rough waves. However, these were not the only dangers that the Jews and Danish fishermen faced. Let's hear the testimony of Franz Thomsen, a sailor who, at the age of 13, participated with his father in the rescue of people. The intense port activity made it difficult for the Gestapo to easily detect the fugitives. However, sometimes, the escape attempt ended in failure, and the person was arrested and placed in custody before being sent to certain death. On the other hand, there was the possibility that the boat carrying someone would sink in the midst of the turbulent waters of the Øresund Passage, and the sailors would drown in the sea. All those who risked escaping to Sweden were aware of the risks, but they agreed that no price was too high for freedom. It is estimated that 8,000 Jews were saved from the clutches of Nazism. 95% of Denmark's Jewish community survived World War II thanks to these kinds of actions. Today, the Danish resistance movement has been commemorated with the distinction of Righteous Among the Nations, an award that pays tribute to those who helped the Jewish population in those dark days. We have reached the end of the video. Leave your comments in the section below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.